Okay, so people really seem to respond to the Way of Kings review, so I guess we're going to go with Words of Radiance this time. Okay, I actually have a physical copy this time, which is weird because I'm too poor to be able to afford a good bookshelf, so I usually get everything on Kindle or something. But yeah, Words of Radiance, the second book in the Stormlight Archive. Right off the bat here, I want to say this is probably my least favorite Stormlight Archive book. That's not to say that it is bad, but something I didn't mention last time is every one of the books within the Stormlight Archive are named after a book within the lore of the world of Roshar. So the first book was The Way of Kings. I'd say that's like 2 parts Buddha to 1 part meditations. So it's a very philosophical text about what the right thing about trying to find virtue and going through and just like a very philosophical text. Whereas Oathbringer, my personal favorite of the Stormlight Archive books, is very much a personal journey. This is a memoir of my favorite character in this series. Whereas I think the other 2 in the series so far is Rhythm of War is basically a research paper, and Words of Radiance is basically a history book. And intentionally or not, I think the actual books tend to take on the characteristics of the books within the fiction. And this is probably a lot of people's favorite book. I imagine that a lot of the people on the 17th Shard podcast will really love Words of Radiance because it is essentially a history book. It gives them a lot of that deep lore that they're super into. Me personally, the world building and the lore is probably one of the least interesting things I find about this world. One of the consistent problems I have with fantasy is that a lot of the times that they have a tendency of not making things very fantastical by explaining things. That's a problem that I have with a lot of Brendon Sanderson books in particular, is that he has this overall tendency towards hard magic systems. Now, I don't necessarily like the hard versus soft magic system divide. My attitude towards magic systems is usually you either have a physical magic system or you have a linguistic magic system. That's broadly hard and that's broadly soft, but I would say the difference is language is something a lot more esoteric and unknowable. And you can have rules for your language. We all adopt them and we all use them every day, but I just don't like them explicitly stated. So a magic system that can get the feel right of a language in and of itself is way better than a magic system that just adds a physics extension onto the world. The Stormlight Archive is very much in that same vein of a very physical magic system that seems like it's more or less adding a physics engine on top of just normal. I think the Arrow would be closer to the Renaissance than anything else. And, just like hard versus soft, that's not to say that this is all like that. There is a degree of interpretation within the odes the aforementioned Words of Radiance, I suppose, in this universe that allow for a degree of interpretation and a degree of linguistic flair. One of the things being the Knights Radiant always swear oaths, and they're always along the same lines, but they're not necessarily the same thing, And then there's a different interpretation of what those oaths necessarily mean. I mean, the first one that all of them swear, life before death, that's just a fairly standard, the journey matters, not the destination, how you get somewhere and how you do something, that kind of moral, that kind of virtuous moral stuff that, people try and endlessly talk about and then other people say isn't complex enough, mostly for the sake of making themselves look better. So, I do like the magic system in this, but it's not my favorite kind of thing. It's a very good system for this, specifically this kind of book, because it's very much that physical, this is a history book, or the research paper type thing of Rhythm of War. Still, it is a good system that does what it's supposed to do. It's a hammer applied to a nail, and I admire its simplicities, kind of, in that sake. I suppose I would be remiss not to note that whereas the last book was very much Kaladin's book, this book is very much Shallan's book. And that, goes back to my initial issues with a lot of Shallan's work, is that it ends up being very expository. A lot of Shallan's chapters are about world building and, filling out the world and everything. And that's not bad in this situation, and I think there is a lot more for her to do in this book. She goes through a lot more struggles that are a lot more interesting and everything. She's still not my favorite character. I actually really like her mentor figure in the beginning here, though, Yasna. If there is a character in this series that I would say I'm the most like, it would be Yasna. Partially because we seem to have about the same sex drive, in case anyone was wondering, but I'm sure no one was, but mostly because I'm the type of person who would give this line. Those who think they know everything are a great deal of annoyance to those of us who actually do. That's a really pretentious thing to say in a book review, asshole. But mostly I just really liked her philosophy on things. One of my favorite things about Yasna in this series is that she'll look at people doing a job and not let the fact that that is a dirty job reflect poorly on their character. Is the thing that reflects on their character is if they're doing that job well. So she'll treat the crew of a ship, who are a notoriously kind of crass bunch of people, more respect than you would expect a princess of the most powerful nation on the planet. Because she looks at them and says, these are men trying to doing a job, and they're doing it as well as they can. And not letting the fact that these might be a distasteful kind of job, like, or I don't know, scraping barnacles off a ship, get in the way of that fact. She doesn't let that get in her way of their estimations, which I think is a very admirable quality that I wish a lot more people would try and do. I try and do that as much as I possibly can, especially when I talk about different kinds of media. This is kind of my go-to example for this, but I don't like the show Re:Zero, but I recognize that it does its job exceedingly well. So you're not going to see me saying that this show was bad, just it's kind of not for me, and I don't really like it all that much. And yeah, I guess if I have one major point, it's that I'd like to see more Yasna. Though, I guess if we're going to get on the subject of characters and character arcs, I suppose, there's at least one point within this book where I feel like, I mentioned in my last review, Brendon Sanderson has this thing where he likes to create really great moments first and then try and create the connective tissue between them in order to, build up these really, highly climactic moments within his writings. And I feel like that, and, that does do a very good job of creating these certain moments. But my problem with Words of Radiance in this regard is there are certain times, there's at least one time near the middle of the book, where one of these hugely climactic, oh my god, this is an awestruck moment happens, but then right afterwards, one of our main characters does something incredibly stupid that undercuts the entire thing. And that is completely part of the character's arc. And it is definitely something that I imagine the character would do. It was Kaladin. I'll just say that. It's something I imagine Kaladin would exactly do. But it does kind of undermine the strongest element of the series for me. These really big climactic moments. I don't know what the solution there is. It is a completely necessary thing for Kaladin's arc in this book to screw up that badly. But it also kind of sucks the air out of the room, for lack of a better term. So it's not a bad thing that it happened, but it does kind of weaken the strongest aspect of the story, if you catch my drift. I don't know. It's like, when I say this, I know somebody's going to read this and say that this shouldn't have happened. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, this thing that was necessary for Kaladin's story arc did end up weakening the strongest aspect of the story in my eyes. This does continue the structure from the last book that I was talking about, where we're seeing a character rise from the lowest aspects of society into increasingly higher aspects of society. Kaladin in this has now gained a measure of respect and well, he's about as high as a dark-eyed person can be in this world, which, if you're some reason watching this without having read the first book, in this world, the denotation of high class and low class is based on eye color, which does make me wonder one specific thing. What happens if, two people who have, green eyes have a kid with brown eyes? Because yeah, I'm pretty fucking sure that's very possible. And you should be too, because you're looking at somebody who who's that's true for. But whatever. Kaladin is in this story ends up being like about as high class as you can be for a dark-eyed person. You know, going from a slave in the first book, you'd think he'd just be happy for the upgrade, but keeping in true form, everybody envies those above them in the social hierarchy. But there is like a moment I kind of recall, and this was probably just like a throwaway line by Sanderson, and I doubt he would remember it, but he was talking about what's the difference between the light-eyed practice ground and the dark-eyed practice ground, and it's just like, well, you're not allowed in it. Which I feel is like a very astute observation. A lot of the times that's how we tend to denote higher class things and upper class things. Though usually we do it through verbiage. A lot of the times when you watch like a very well-reviewed, like Oscar-worthy movie, the moral is honestly about on par with any sort of bland superhero movie. Or, you know, the actual story arc is about on par with something you might see in a Saturday morning cartoon. And that's not to say that these things are bad, but they are just sort of signaling but there is just sort of a kind of pretentiousness I tend to find about things that are written for upper class people, because it's people like media that makes them feel smart. One of the ways to do that is to just be somewhat confusing and use confusing verbiage at times. And I do feel like that kind of is like a rather astute observation that Kaladin had in this series, that my review and I want to talk about it. So my final thoughts on this ultimately boil down to, I think in some ways it's an improvement. For one thing, the book actually gives Shallan something to do throughout the story, and it really is gratifying and it really is nice seeing Kaladin gain a measure of respect in this world after we saw all the pain he went through in his first book. But the necessities of the character arc kind of get in the way of the strongest point get somewhat in the way of the strongest aspects of Sanderson's writing style, as well as a greater focus on the lore of the world. Not like it as much as the first one. It's still a really good book, and if you liked The Way of Kings, you're gonna like Words of Radiance. And again, if there are no other reason, you should read it, because then you get to read Oathbringer, which I still say is the best one.